It was a quiet afternoon in the leafy suburbs, the sun shining bright, birds chirping away merrily, and all seeming to be calm. But that peace was about to be broken. Three young men swaggered down the street, wearing tank tops that showed off their bulging muscles. Now, laughter was echoing through the neighborhood, loud and brash, full of cocky energy. They could quite clearly feel themselves invincible as they walked up to a small, tidy little house standing at the corner of the street. Behind that house lived Mr. Thomas, a veteran 91-year-old man who had witnessed more during his lifetime than most could imagine. He had fought in wars, withstood the hardships of battles, and seen the cruelty of mankind. Yet, he was still sharp and capable. His mind was as strong as ever. Mr. Thomas had served his country honorably, but the ravages of time had begun to slow him down body-wise. However, his spirit remained tough as nails. Three youths saw Mr. Thomas sitting on his porch talking amiably with his neighbors. Deciding him to be an easy target for their rash pranks, they could not see what an old man might do if challenged by three young muscular men like themselves. They saw him as the weak and vulnerable kind whom they might harass without consequences. Little did they know whom they were about to mess with. One of them, a pretty loud and annoying young man by the name of Jake, snorted at the old veteran, saying, "Hey, old man, you'd better get inside before you break a hip or something." His so-called friends broke out laughing at Jake's insulting the old man. Mr. Thomas, always composed, with a warm smile, said, "Afternoon, boys." He had dealt with worse in life and wasn't going to let two young punks steal his day. He had never been one to back down from a fight, no matter how big or little. But the young men were hunting for trouble. Indignant by Mr. Thomas's composure and poise, Jake pushed it one step further. He swaggered closer to the porch, his chest puffed out as he loomed over the old man. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Can't hear us with those old ears of yours?" Jake jeered, voice dripping with arrogance. His friends stood behind him, grinning like hyenas, clearly relishing the scene. He was not the sort of fellow to be ruffled by a few sneers, however. He'd battled far worse foes in his lifetime, and he aimed to see that these urchins didn't get the satisfaction of rattling his cage. "I hear just fine, son," he said calmly, "but you might want to learn some manners before you open your mouth again." They were not ready for such a response. Overstretched, Jake was shocked by the elder's biting words and furrowed his brows. He had always been dominating his environment because he did not get used to people speaking back against him, especially not some old man who sat there, weak in his eyes. Deciding that he would be able to show off in front of his friends, he took another step forward, trying to dominate. "Or what?" Jake prodded, his voice dripping with derision. "What are you gonna do, old man?" Mr. Thomas just smiled, the kind that comes from years and years of living, of knowing things that young and headstrong people haven't yet learned. He calmly reached into his pocket for his phone, not once breaking his gaze on Jake. "You really don't want to do this, son," he warned. But Jake was too deep into his performance now. He wouldn't back down. His ego wouldn't let him. He had an audience, his friends. Curious about what happened next? Stay tuned to find out. So, Blake, "I'm sorry, Jake," was now inches from Mr. Thomas. "Do what? Call the cops? You think they're going to come running just because an old man got scared?" Jake sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. His friends snickered behind him, clearly enjoying the drama unfolding before their eyes. Not a word said. Mr. Thomas dialed a phone number and held it to his ear. The young men, still just sure enough, but puzzled, watched as the old man cheerfully spoke into the telephone. "Hey, Bill," Mr. Thomas stated levelly, composedly. "I've got a little situation here. Some kids think they're tougher than they are. Can you send some guys over to straighten them out?" Uncertain smiles paired with awkward looks passed between the young men. They were starting to sense that perhaps it was not just a game. Who was Mr. Thomas talking to? Jake, as much as he tried to salvage dignity, was far from as confident as he was a few seconds ago. However, he was by no means about to step backward. Mr. Thomas hung up and turned to Jake. His smile hadn't relaxed one bit. "They'll be here in a few minutes," he said, his voice flat and without variation. "You might want to stay around. I'm sure they'll have a lot to teach you about respect." It was like someone had flicked a switch. Jake's pals could feel something was seriously amiss. They started to edge away. Unlike Jake, they were not nearly as confident of themselves, and they certainly didn't want around when whoever was coming showed up. But Jake was too puffed up with pride to give up now. "Come on, guys, he's just messing with us," he said, but did it in a voice that did not have nearly the same cockiness to it. The minutes stretched out like an eternity as they stood there, and the tension was palpable. And then, when it seemed to have all been foretold, the sound of engines smashed the stillness. 3 large SUVs came up and stopped right in front of Mr. Thomas's house. The doors opened and out stepped a cluster of men. Big, tough-looking dudes, not the kind of guys that would be trifled with. No uniforms, but an aura of general command sent a chill down Jake's spine. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered man, pushed across the porch. "You summoned me, Thomas?" he asked, scanning the scene before him. Mr. Thomas nodded. "These boys here think they're a little tougher than they actually are. Thought you might want to give them a lesson in respect." The man's attention now turned to Jake and his friends. His face, hard and unyielding as stone, seemed to be knitted into a mask of injustice. "Is that right?" he said, his voice low, but capable of chilling blood in a heartbeat. Jake's plum-colored confidence evaporated in an instant, making him look at that moment rather pale. His friends had retreated several paces, with that look on their faces that wanted no part of what was to come. I think there's been a misunderstanding," Jake stuttered, the cockiness completely drained from his voice. His once brave front was crumbling, and now he looked like a deer caught in headlights. The men weren't impressed. "Misunderstanding?" one of them repeated, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I don't think so, kid. You disrespected a man who's seen more than you'll ever know. Now you're gonna stand here and apologize." Jake's face was now a deep red with embarrassment. He glanced over at his friends, hoping to find a lifeline. I'm sorry," he stammered, barely above a whisper. "What was that?" the man demanded, taking a step closer. "Louder." "I'm sorry," Jake shouted the words now, voice shaking, all remnants of bravado gone. Mr. Thomas nodded his head in approval from where he sat on the porch. "That's better," he said quietly. "Now get out of here before you make things worse for yourself." Without another word, Jake turned and bailed down the street, his friends fast on his heels. The muscle-bound bravado they'd sported moments earlier vanished in an instant, replaced by fear and humiliation. As they disappeared into the darkness, Mr. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. He smiled himself. "Still teaching lessons, huh? Even after all these years?" said one of the men who had come to his aid, as he clapped Mr. Thomas on the shoulder. "Some things never change," said Mr. Thomas with a grin. As the men left, Mr. Thomas sat back and reflected on how things had changed with time. He had fought so many battles, physical and emotional, throughout life. In earlier days, he would have confronted disrespect with confrontation. But the wisdom of the years teaches a man that patience and respect are often the best weapons. About the hubris of youth, when so many young people feel invincible, they learn that strength is not in the muscles, nor intimidation, but in character, experience, and with a cool head. Mr. Thomas had lived enough to have learned that life itself humbles the proud. It was not revenge, nor was it a question of who was tougher. It was more the standing up for what he believed in at that moment, by defending his dignity so that those young men, and anyone watching, would know that everyone deserves respect, regardless of age or orientation. It was that easy, really. With a simple phone call and a bit of waiting for them to turn up, Mr. Thomas had managed to turn the tables on these muscleheads who thought they could push him around. Revenge isn't in it. Just that sometimes one needs to remind the world that respect is something everyone deserves, regardless of their age. So, what do you think of this story? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more interesting stories. We'll see you folks in the next video. Curious to see what went down when a rich lady tried to insult a bus driver? Check out this video to find out.